A group, Doctors Without Borders, today demanding an independent investigation into this weekend's airstrike. The attack hit a hospital in Afghanistan run by the group, killing at least 22 people, including 12 aid workers. President Obama offering his condolences over this incident, and the White House released a statement from the president also promising to get answers about possible U.S. involvement. Quote, the Department of Defense has launched a full investigation, and we will await the results of that inquiry before making a definitive judgment as to the circumstances of this tragedy. I have asked the Department of Defense to keep me apprised of the investigation and expect a full accounting of the facts. Doctors Without Borders says it wants an independent investigation. I want to bring in retired Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer into our conversation about this. He's a former U.S. Army intelligence officer. And thank you very much for joining us this morning, this afternoon. The Pentagon now says it's going to have this full investigation. And Doctors with Borders say that we want something different. We want something independent. What are the kinds of things that you look for in the very beginning? Where do you even start when you have those questions about how on earth did something like this happen?
Well, tragically, this is not the first time this has happened. When I was there in 2003, we bombed a madrasa, killed a bunch of women and children because of bad intelligence. And in this case, there may be some of that. The Afghan forces were, I believe, the source of the intelligence on this specific target. And there's been more than once where they've been completely careless on giving us information. And in this case, it was sustained. It was a long-term thing. And clearly, the other thing that failed here was command and control. So the thing you have to look at, Suzanne, is the fact that when the Doctors Without Borders contacted us, the United States, saying, hey, stop, we didn't stop. So there's two pieces we have to go at here. Was the intelligence reliable? And why didn't we stop when we had the correct information saying this was a bad target? Those two things have to be sorted through. I'm not sure what Doctors Without Borders wants regarding independent. I mean, we've been very self-critical of this. The Pentagon, General Joe Dunford just took over as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. You have General Campbell in charge over there, both very honorable men who actually know and will do the right thing in this investigation. So I do believe it'll be investigated, and I do believe both generals will ensure it gets fixed.
I want to ask about that second piece you talked about, the fact that they asked the U.S. airstrike stop, and that didn't happen in a timely way. What would be the reason why that wouldn't happen? Would that be a communications problem? Would that be not actually believing the source that was coming from? What do you think was that disconnect?
Excellent question, and I believe it had to do more with the time it takes for information to flow from a remote location to the right authorities within the chain of command and then giving the command to stop. Let's face it, even with 21st century communications, Suzanne, you know, everything cannot be spontaneous. So I do believe they called in the right folks, but then again, you know, it just takes time. The other factor here, obviously, is once you start shooting, it's difficult to get the forces to kind of pull back. So, and the third factor, let me throw this in here, because overall, the operation against the Taliban in Kunduz was successful. They've actually been able to expel the forces out. So the one bit of good news here, I don't mean to put a happy face on it, but the fact is the Afghan forces did not collapse like a cheap card table, and they sustained combat, were able to successfully push out the military, the foe. So it tells me two things. First, we are actually making progress in Afghanistan. To depart now would be a complete mistake. We do need to get to the bottom of this and figure out what exactly happened. Why wasn't there a timely cessation of fire, and how do we prevent this going forward?
And this happens in terms of frequency, quite frequent, that you have these battles between the Taliban, NATO forces, Afghan forces in this area for days. And the Taliban uses these particular areas, whether it's a hospital or a school or a church or a mosque, as a shield. And how do you prevent something like that from happening? Because that will continue to be a strategy.
Absolutely. This happened in my, I note this in my book, Operation Dark Heart, 2003. That the Taliban were actually encouraging the Afghan militia to give us the wrong information, thereby striking one of their tribal adversaries. This has gone on forever. So this is why good intelligence, solid intelligence, is so very important to being effective in this environment. We've cut back to about 10,000 troops. We are minimizing our offensive capability. We're trying to put the Afghans forward. But with that said then, Suzanne, you see all these tribal rivalries which go back 1,000 years now popping up again. So we have to be very cautious, very careful when we accept information like this. But in a case like this, once the target's identified as being friendly, you've got to stop rapidly, and I think clearly that's something we have to get to the bottom to here.
Lieutenant, do you think this underscores the need to have human intelligence on the ground? Just how critical, how important that is?
Oh, human intelligence is critical in this environment. We cannot rely on drones. We cannot rely on signals intelligence, which is phone intercepts. Knowing what's over that other wall can only be done if you have penetrated the terrorist network. In this case, I do believe the intelligence should have been there to tell us where these guys were being, where the Taliban were actually hanging out. And again, this is where the disconnect may have come, is through that breakdown. But the more human intelligence you have, the more you have specifically inside the network, the better chances are you can defeat that network. Absolutely.
All right. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, thank you so much. I appreciate your perspective.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you.